They were still cheering when the bill arrived. Crowds flooded the streets of London in May 1945. Flags waved from windows. Strangers hugged. Church bells rang until hands went numb. Britain had survived. Hitler was defeated. The war in Europe was over. Winston Churchill stood on a balcony and promised a future worthy of the sacrifice. Behind closed doors, a very different scene was unfolding. In a quiet office, deep inside the Treasury, a clerk stared at a ledger and said the words no one wanted to hear. There's nothing left. No gold. No dollars. No overseas reserves. Britain had won the war, but the country was broke. Worse than broke, it was trapped. What almost no one in those streets understood was that the war had ended on the battlefield, but it had just begun on paper. And the most powerful empire in history was about to discover that survival had come with a price tag it could never truly afford. This is the story of how Britain fought for its life, accepted help to stay alive, and slowly realized that the help came with strings tight enough to pull an empire apart. The story doesn't begin in victory. It begins years earlier, with panic. In the autumn of 1940, London burned. German bombs fell night after night. Buildings collapsed. Fires spread faster than they could be contained. Underground stations became bedrooms. Children slept in helmets. And while the public braced itself for invasion, Britain's leaders were facing a quieter terror. The money was running out. Britain had entered the war as the world's banker. For decades, the pound sterling had been global money. British banks financed trade. British ships carried goods. British investments stretched from India to Africa to the Americas. On paper, Britain looked invincible. But war didn't care about paper. Modern war consumed resources at a scale the world had never seen. Steel, oil, food, ammunition, fuel. Britain produced some of it, but not enough. The country depended on imports to survive, and imports had to be paid for in hard currency. At first, Britain paid with gold. Then it sold foreign assets. Then it liquidated investments that had taken generations to build. Paintings came off walls. Shares were quietly transferred. Overseas railways, utilities, factories, all sold to keep the war going one more month. Inside Whitehall, officials whispered numbers they didn't want recorded. "How long can we last?" one asked. "Months," another replied. "If we're lucky." Across the Atlantic, the United States watched carefully. America was officially neutral, but not indifferent. Its factories were intact. Its economy was roaring back to life after the Depression. And it held what Britain desperately needed: dollars, supplies, and industrial capacity. But there was a rule: cash and carry. If Britain wanted American weapons, it had to pay cash up front and transport them itself. No credit, no exceptions. By late 1940, Britain could barely afford food. Its weapons were becoming impossible. Churchill knew the truth before most of his cabinet did. He read the reports late at night, cigar burning low, eyes fixed on columns of figures that spelled disaster. Britain was still standing, but it was bleeding out financially. It turned to the one man who could change everything: Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In December 1940, Churchill sat down to write a letter that would shape the rest of the century. He didn't beg, couldn't. Britain still needed to look strong. But between the lines, the message was clear. "We are running out of money," Churchill admitted. "The moment approaches when we shall no longer be able to pay cash for shipping and other supplies. In other words, help us, or we fall." Roosevelt understood exactly what that meant. If Britain fell, Germany would dominate Europe. American security would be threatened. But Roosevelt also understood something else. Britain had no leverage left. What followed was presented to the public as generosity. Friendly neighbor lending tools to another neighbor whose house was on fire. It was called Lend-Lease. Weapons, food, fuel, raw materials. Everything Britain needed would flow across the Atlantic. Payment would be deferred. No immediate cash required. The public loved it. Newspapers praised American goodwill. Speeches spoke of shared values and common cause. Behind the scenes, the tone was colder. American officials demanded full access to Britain's financial records. They wanted to know exactly what Britain owned, what it owed, and what it could sell. One Treasury official reportedly muttered, If they want our help, they're going to open the books. And Britain did. What the Americans found was shocking even to them. Britain was not just strained, it was exhausted. The empire's wealth was already gone, converted into explosions and smoke over Europe. But help came with conditions. Britain would sell off its remaining overseas investments. Britain would end preferential trade within its empire. Britain would accept American oversight. Strategically important British bases would be handed over. In one of the most telling deals of the war, Britain traded 99-year leases on key naval and air bases in the Atlantic and Caribbean for 50 aging American destroyers. One British officer looked at the ships and whispered, "These barely float." Another replied, "That's the price of survival." Power was already shifting, quietly, without a single shot fired. As Lend-Lease flowed in, Britain survived. Convoys crossed dangerous waters, factories stayed supplied, soldiers were armed. The war turned, but the bill was only being postponed. By 1945, Germany was defeated, Japan was collapsing, and suddenly, the help stopped. Almost overnight, Lend-Lease was terminated. British officials were stunned. One asked an American counterpart, "Surely there will be a transition." The answer was blunt. The war is over. Britain still needed food. Its cities were shattered. Its infrastructure was worn down. Millions of men needed jobs. Rationing wasn't easing. It was getting worse. There was no money to pay for imports, so Britain went back to Washington. This time there was no talk of friendship. What Britain needed now was a loan. John Maynard Keynes, the most famous economist in the world, led the British delegation. He was tired, ill, and painfully aware that Britain had no bargaining power. He tried one last argument. "This war was fought for civilization," Keynes said. "Surely this is not the moment to squeeze an ally." The Americans listened, then they slid the terms across the table. The loan would be massive. The interest would be low. But there was a condition that would change everything. Britain would make the pound sterling fully convertible into dollars. Keynes went pale. He knew what that meant. For decades, Britain had controlled how sterling moved. Convertibility would allow anyone holding pounds to demand dollars in exchange. And Britain didn't have enough dollars to meet that demand. Keynes warned them. "This will drain us dry." The Americans didn't budge. Britain signed. In July 1947, convertibility went into effect. Within weeks, the worst fears came true. Foreign holders of sterling rushed to cash out. Dollars poured out of Britain's reserves. The Treasury panicked. Phones rang non-stop. One official reportedly shouted, "It's a run. We're finished." After just 37 days, Britain suspended convertibility. The damage was done. The pound was weakened. Confidence was shattered. Austerity tightened. Rationing dragged on into the 1950s. Meat, sugar, fuel, all scarce in a country that had technically won the war. Across the empire, the message was clear. Britain no longer had the money to rule. India gained independence, and others followed. Maintaining the empire was no longer possible. It was an ideology that ended. It was arithmetic. Meanwhile, the United States surged ahead. Its factories dominated global markets. The dollar replaced the pound. New institutions like the IMF and World Bank shaped the rules of trade. American bases dotted the globe, many sitting on land once controlled by Britain. The war had not destroyed Britain's empire with bombs. It had dismantled it with contracts. Here's the part almost no one knows. Britain finished paying off its World War II debt in 2006. More than 60 years after the victory parades, the final installment was set. An empire that once financed the world and spent generations paying for survival. This wasn't a story of villains and heroes. It was a story of power, of who had it, who lost it, and how modern wars are won not just with soldiers, but with balance sheets. Britain didn't lose World War II. It lost control. If you've stayed with this story until now, take a second to reflect on that. A single decision made under pressure reshaped global power for the rest of the century. If you found this breakdown valuable, make sure to like the video. It helps more than you think. Subscribe if you want more deep stories like this. And comment below. Do you think Britain had any real choice? Or was the outcome inevitable? History doesn't always announce itself with explosions. Sometimes it arrives quietly. with a bill, and this was the most expensive victory in modern history.